This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this episode of Roots and All. This week's guest is Roger Hirons, a horticultural expert and speaker who's been in the industry for over 35 years. Roger's just released a really excellent book called The Gardener's Guide to Hedges and Living Boundaries. And the book covers preparation and design advice for establishing a new living boundary, advice on dealing with existing boundaries, planting for both your human and wildlife neighbours, and also a directory of some really interesting hedging plants, climbers and trees. Roger starts by explaining his route into the horticultural world.
My father was a doctor down in the town of Bournemouth, and my mum and dad's downtime when they weren't in the surgeries was gardening. So when I was very, very little, I was probably only 3 or 4, I quickly realised that if I wanted to see Dad, I either had to go to the surgery, in other words, someone had to take me there, or I had to go into the garden when he was in his downtime. So I really got into gardening from a very early age. My youngest memories of being useful to Dad was actually pricking out tagetes at about the age of 5 and climbing up on some yellow steps to get onto some staging in a greenhouse to do that. And then when I got to O-level choices, my father gave me the best advice I could possibly have. And that was basically find something you love and then you'll actually want to stick at it and you'll become useful at it. And I basically got to Pershore College of Horticulture. After Pershore College, I then went straight into the garden centre industry, started running plant centres. I did that for nearly 20 years. Alongside that, it was in my contract from 1990 to start doing public speaking because I had to bring a lot of people into the garden centre and present talks. So in 1992 was my very first talk to a WI in Odell in Northamptonshire. And then after that, I ended up doing between 12 and 15 talks a year ever since then until 7 years ago. And then my pastor challenged me. He said, pray to Jesus and you may find that you can have a redirection in business. Because by then I was then landscaping and I no longer was at a garden centre. And what basically meant was that I was in my early 50s and the likelihood of staying fit and healthy as you get older is less. And therefore moving so much heavy stuff in landscaping isn't good for me in the long run. So my prayers were massively answered. And basically my talk circuit went to over 70 a year in a year and a half. And that meant then that I could get rid of my tools and trucks and trailers and start focusing on writing and talks. And as a default of doing so many talks, I think the year I was asked to do this last book that I've just done was back in 2019, and I'd just done 21 talks in Wiltshire. So my name was picked up at that point and I was asked, and by default, I wrote the book.
Brilliant. So what is the book about?
So for me, my heart has always been the right plant for the job first time round. I see too many people wasting time buying the wrong plant. And it then just does a period of time, then it comes to a demise or never performs of what God intended it. I mean, I think if it's meant to have pink flowers, we should all enjoy the pink flower. And if it's being in the situation where it won't even produce the pink flower, then it seems a shame we're doing it. And secondly, the whole point of the flower is it then fruits behind it, which is great for the wildlife.
Perfect. So I read the book, loved it, and there were lots of questions that I had that sort of arising from the book. And my first one, I think, is probably, I know why I might choose to do it, but in general, why plant a hedge or a living boundary instead of, say, installing a fence?
Okay. Back in 1992, the statistic batting around in those days was that a quarter of everyone's garden needed to be down to wildlife. And I think I had a mental picture of people going 3/4 of the way up the garden, whacking in a fence at that point that was open with wire, and then just putting "do not keep out unless you're wild" beyond that point. And I think really what they're trying to say is that if you can keep all these corridors and areas that are not walked by you and me on a daily basis, then the nature will move in. So if you've got a hedgerow system and you've got this nice foot of leafy cover under there, you'd be staggered at what level of insects and small creatures will live in that space.
What form might a living boundary take?
So a living boundary could be anything where you're letting God's greenery take over the space that would in fact be inert otherwise. I've literally been in jobs where I've walked along hedgerows and little dormice have run out and sat next to me on a rock while I've been carrying 12 or 15 tons of material past them in wheelbarrows. And it's just sat there and looked at me. And it's almost like you're at one with nature because you're kind of like preserving the hedgerows that are there. It's massive. It really is.
You mentioned something in the book called a fedge, which I'm not sure many people would be aware what it is. Can you just explain what that is in terms of living boundaries?
Yes, certainly. Way back in horticultural college days, I was taught about the fedge. There are two different types of fedge. The one I'm talking about specifically here is a cross between a man-made object and God's plants. And what we're trying to do here is put a basic post and rail or post and wire fence right through the middle of where your boundary is. And then you plant either side of it slightly staggered and let the whole thing get swallowed up by a planting scheme. This is particularly useful for people that have a framework. So if you're in an open plan scenario and they said you must not go over 3 foot with your open plan, you could do your little basic post and wire fence to that height and then make sure that everything stays within that. And you know you're not losing the dimensions that they require you to do. But it also stops the postman walking a hole straight through the middle of it while it's developing.
Yeah, it is a good idea and a good solution. You mentioned wildlife, and I'm guessing living boundaries are good in all sorts of ways, particularly probably habitat and food value. Are there any plants that you would particularly include for wildlife?
Yeah. So I think during the summer months, the biggest message I can give out of that question for me is that one of our issues is overwintering. If we cut everything back very hard and we produce nothing for food for the winter months, then the creatures cannot stay there. And there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of beneficial insects in the garden. But unfortunately, the slug, the snail, and the vine weevil kind of have got the name that we must obliterate and clean everything because that will remove their habitat. But it will also remove the habitat of the hundreds of beneficial insects. So winter interest plants is key within that boundary system, is massive.
Some people choose to not have a living boundary just because having a fence can be less maintenance, or they can perceive it to be less maintenance. Have you got any solutions that people could have if they don't want to have a particularly high maintenance boundary?
Yeah, basically, if you plant the right plant in there first time, and this book will explain this, then actually maintenance might be one trim a year. Well, you could argue that I've got to go and creosote or cuprinol or whatever else it is material wise that you paint all over your fence. I know creosote you can't anymore, but basically every single year people are out there spraying and painting their wood. And if you were clipping your hedge once a year, wouldn't that be okay?
Yeah, I mean, it would for me because I love a hedge. But as I say, I think maybe the perception is these things can be more high maintenance, but they don't necessarily need to be. And you mentioned obviously the postman taking a shortcut through your hedge. Thinking about people passing through hedges, are there any that are really good for security purposes as well?
Yeah, I mean, very early on in my career of running plant centres, I learnt about nature's barbed wire, if you like, and things like the Barbary family, which are the Berberis. They're wonderful for all the very, very small birds will thrive on you having Barbary hedges because none of the big birds can get in there and all the little birds can go in. So you will have all sorts of finches and blue tits and all sorts of stuff going in that you wouldn't get if you've got much more open plants. And then the prickliness of them protect the fruit for the birds so that other animals can't get the fruit.
Yeah, ideal. I mean, also, you have got in the book a long list of different plants that are suitable for different situations. And I thought there were some maybe people hadn't heard of. And are there any really unusual ones that you find surprises people or that you'd like to recommend that you think are underused?
Yeah, if you've got a pen and a bit of paper, and it's a long word, but there's a plant called Rhamnus alternus argentio variegata. And that's a particularly nice variegated wall shrub with a high degree of white margin around the leaf. And by the way, if ever you get a white margin around a leaf or a gold margin around a leaf and the green is in the middle, don't put them in windy situations. It should always be the other way round. So windy plants will have a splash of colour in the middle of the leaf and the green around the outside, which is the chlorophyll, is protecting it against the wind. This plant is particularly good at basically being fan trained against a wall or fence. And it has a very deep root rather than a wide one, so it won't smash up foundations. And it has small white fruits in the spring and bluey black fruits in the winter.
Perfect. Again, what I liked about your book, because I like people who've obviously done this for a long time and are writing from real proper experience. What I really liked about it was what you said about ground prepping for cotoneasters. I just wondered if you could talk about what they need in order to succeed, because I found that really, really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favourite things to mention when I'm in a talk is that why are apples round? And it's directly related to the question here, because the apple tree is related to the cotoneaster, and it's also related to a pyracantha or a spirea or a Portuguese laurel or a hawthorn and lots and lots and lots of others. But actually, God's developed it to make this rose sickness in the ground as it builds, because it's actually related to the rose. In Victorian times, there was always that sort of saying going around, and it's gone through many generations: don't plant a rose where an old rose has been. But that actually means don't plant that cotoneaster where that apple tree's been. So this is why it's very important. In part of my assessing within the book is that you assess what's going on next door as much as you do with your own land, because their roots are coming into your land and it might affect your planting. And a boundary's there for a long, 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 long time. So you've got to get it right. It's a lot of homework.
And what would you do in physical terms if you were planting one? Would you have to take some of the old soil out or just not replant there?
Well, in old school training, it would be advisable just to leave the land alone from anything related to that for between 10 and 15 years. It very much depends on the type of soil you've got. If you've got a heavy, heavy soil that holds onto all the nutrient and everything else, then it's more like the 15 years. But if it's a sandy, open soil, then nutrient doesn't stay there for very long anyway. And you'll be putting loads of fresh nutrient in. So you're more likely to be able to bring that down by 5 years. But basically, wherever the root system has gone, you cannot then plant another member of that same family in the same space.
Got you. And also another technique that you mentioned is creating bunds. I wonder if you could just talk about what they are and why you might use them.
Yeah. So the bund world is amazing. Basically, it's a mound, if you like. So where you may have a small retaining wall at the front of your garden, and you might just, instead of planting the hedge right down behind the wall at ground level, you might put some soil behind it, as long as you reinforce that wall to take the weight of the soil. And lots of builders can work that out for you. And then you can do a gentle mound or an abrupt mound, which basically means you have some sleepers or something on the back of it to retain it. But you can increase the height with the soil, and then you can plant that up. And if you plant a 3-foot plant behind a 3-foot wall, it's at wall height. Whereas if you planted it near the top of the wall, then it's already at 5 foot high plus.
Yeah, it's a really useful thing, I think. Are there any plants that are particularly well suited to that?
Yeah, so that then allows you to go away from all the tree world into the smaller shrub world, because small shrubs have small roots. If it only goes 3 foot, then it's only going to have a 1 foot root system. So it's not going to be 1.5 foot root system. So it's never going to be something that smashes the wall out with its own force. And I've got this section at the very back of the book on common pitfalls. And this is when people plant the wrong sort of plant with the wrong root systems right close up to infrastructure. And then 10, 15, maybe 20 years goes by, and then suddenly massive cracks appear. And what started off as being a good value situation becomes a very expensive one.
Yeah, I think people are sometimes nervous about planting up against structures. Again, are there any plants that are well suited to that?
Yeah, so the climbing world and the wall shrub world and the small shrub world are much safer. The bigger the plant, the bigger the root system, the more it's going to push. So if you start planting oak trees and beech trees near it, you are going to have troubles long term, without a shadow of a doubt. I mean, even if you're pruning it to, I don't know, 6 foot and keeping it there, genetically, it's saying, well, one day I might become a 90-foot tree. So I've got that genetics in me to keep pushing. You're reducing it because you're keeping the sale effect to a minimum by keeping it at the sensible height of 6 feet.
Obviously, there's so much advice in the book. There's lots of different things that you cover, and you do cover staking newly planted plants. But I just wondered again if you've got any really quick tips that people could take away from that.
Yeah, best tip I could give you ever is always put the stake on the side where the wind will hit the stake first and push the tree away from the stake. That's the best advice you can have in a nutshell.
Brilliant. And why is that? What's the theory behind that, Roger?
So basically, if you have it blowing away from the stake will never rub onto the tree. If you do it the other way around, the tree could easily rub onto the stake. And if you've got a rosaceous tree, like an apple tree, the chances are you'll get some nasty wounds in there quite quickly. And then you can get all sorts of cankers and disease, which are nasty, and that can shorten the length of the tree or inhibit the fruit. We have cows so we can milk them and have the milk. Well, fruit trees, we have them so that we can enjoy the fruit. And if you don't master your planting on those sorts of situations, then you can reduce the reason for you planting in the first place.
You spoke about wildlife, and again, I think sometimes there's a little bit of a mystery around when to cut particular hedges, especially if you're thinking of catering for the wildlife. Have you got any advice on that?
Yeah, so I've always been nervous. Pershaw again, way back, taught me that protect the plant through the winter months. And I suppose me being down in Bournemouth area now in Dorset, then it's a lot milder here. If it's a -5 here for a night, then it's -8 north of Oxford, almost guaranteed. And it's getting colder as you go north, especially into the middle. So we were always taught basically leave the plants long in the tooth, the sort of autumn side of winter, and then come towards the end of winter. So late January through to Feb, then you start pruning stuff, because then you've been able to overwinter stuff. There's stuff long in the tooth, and there's classic examples where actually long in the tooth proves that you keep the insects really close at heart because you've kept those winter habitats, and you won't if you scalp them. So if you see a flail alarm on a tractor ripping it with an inch of its life in October, then there's nothing left for nature to protect itself with. So it has to go somewhere else.
Yeah, got you. Also, I think you mentioned a few of the common culprits in the book, but there are some plants that are perhaps used quite often that aren't that suitable for creating living boundaries. Are there any that you would say steer clear of, or is it just very situation dependent?
I think you're absolutely right. It is very situation dependent. So I have, over the years, assessed situations where I've been to people's houses. Most of the time, they don't need to plant anything that has in its genetics to get over 15 feet. Therefore, you can keep it at 9 feet all its life or less. And basically, it's all to do with the length of your garden and using what they call the hypotenuse, which helps you on a triangle. That's the long part of the triangle. That's using the hypotenuse to the best effect. And a couple of internal hedges within a border at 6 or 7 feet can do the extra bit of privacy you need, stopping you planting a 35-footer at the far end.
That's a really good tip as well. And thinking about that, obviously your book, but is there any advice you'd give to people who are considering maybe replacing their fences or looking into living boundaries, who might be a little bit reticent and a little bit fearful of what the hedge might become in the long run? Are there any good resources that you would recommend?
Yeah, I think the biggest tip on that, really, I suppose, would be to do your homework in what you want it to do long term first. Start that as your goal. Because if you say to yourself, well, actually, I want something that's going to hide Mrs. Jones's window at the far end of my property, and you've got 200 feet between her and it, then you can do a couple of hedges that are only just a bit taller than you halfway down your garden, and you've hidden it. And you haven't got to go and plant anything big at all anywhere near the end of your garden. And several of those 6-foot hurdles, if you like, is all you need. If you've got a shorter space to work with, then perhaps you need someone to come around and talk to you about specialist planting like pleaching, which is when you have like a flat fence panel of foliage above a fence, but it's the same shape as a fence panel. So it's thin and narrow, and it's not bulking out over both sides of the garden, which is a big issue, because as soon as you get lots of foliage coming out over into your land, all your neighbours, then it becomes a very dry, inert space.
Yeah, I think that is a problem. And actually, sort of going off on a slight tangent now, I think in a lot of smaller gardens, the issue is that they don't want the bulk at the base of the hedge, but they want the growth at the top, which is why I think there was such a trend for things like pleach trees. Is there anything that you can think of that actually provides that you can maybe limb up, or just would not give you the bulk at the base?
I mean, again, it's all down to how you train stuff. So if you, from day one, choose your plants accordingly, you can actually choose ones that are going to be how you want to develop it long term. It's all about what you want in the long run. So you could get something that was actually what they call top work, which means it has a 6-foot or 8-foot clear trunk, and then all the stuff happens above that. And then you can start training it accordingly. And it means that you've got nothing below the fence height at all, if you want to. And then you could plant things of contrast under it, depending on its angle. You could plant roses along there, all sorts. If I ever have to build a fence for someone, I always try and advocate the joy of being able to have the workings on the side for my customer, because then my customer has got natural screw-in points for developing plants on the inside of their fence system. Naturally there, because you've got the post and you've got the rail system in there.
Thank you very much to Roger for taking part in this interview. I hope you found it useful. And I thank you to you for listening as always. Now, Dr. Ian Bedford is talking about how the potential loss of one of our most beautiful butterflies is, to be frank, indicative of the wider abuses that we're committing against nature.
Out of 17,500 species of butterflies that exist on Earth, just 57 are native to Britain. And whether we see butterflies when we're out in the countryside or at home in our garden, we'll probably all enjoy watching them flutter amongst the flowers in search of nectar. But apart from the pleasure that butterflies can bring us, their susceptibility to environmental changes make them an important indicator of the health of the habitats that they live within. And so it's quite alarming that recent surveys reveal that very few of Britain's butterfly species are doing well, and that their numbers have halved over the past 40 years. Most likely through the loss of countless natural habitats, which include 98% of the wildflower meadows that were commonplace in Britain before the 1960s. And only last summer, Butterfly Conservation reported that 24 species of Britain butterflies are heading towards extinction, and that 5 more species are now on the critically endangered red list. But one of those 5 is very sadly Britain's largest butterfly, Papillon machion britannicus, the British swallowtail. A spectacular yellow and black coloured butterfly with a 4-inch wingspan, displaying vibrant blue and red markings on its distinctive tailed hindwings. Britain's swallowtail is actually a unique subspecies of the continental swallowtail, but although it looks similar, it's a little smaller with richer coloured wings. And it has more specific habitat requirements too, colonising only marshy wetland areas and with a much smaller range of caterpillar food plants, namely fennel and milk parsley. But although Britain's swallowtail has never been common or widespread, there were breeding populations from East Sussex up to Yorkshire that had been documented during the 19th century. But over time, these all disappeared, apart from those within the Norfolk Broads, which have remained the butterfly's final bastion for the past 70 years. However, as Norfolk's swallowtail population continues to decline, only 16 known breeding sites remain. So could it be too late to prevent Britain's largest butterfly from becoming globally extinct? Well, hopefully not, with conservation and habitat management programmes currently being supported by the Norfolk Wildlife Trust and the RSPB. But it's unlikely to be an easy issue to resolve, since a number of contributing factors are already known. From rivers that feed the Norfolk Broads being polluted with systemic agricultural pesticides, to the theft of swallowtail caterpillars from nature reserves, and then the recent appearance of a rapidly spreading fungal disease that's killing the swallowtail's food plants. But also, as a consequence of global warming, there's an alarming possibility that the rising sea levels will cause salinisation of the low-lying Norfolk Broads, and then their unique freshwater habitats and their biodiversity will undoubtedly be lost forever.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.